Hello and welcome everyone to the August 2023 Integration Down Under. Let's go through the organizers of Integration Down Under. That's Martin from Perth, Dan from Brisbane, Mick from Sydney, Wagner from Auckland, and myself from Melbourne. Nice and warm Melbourne at the moment. I think it was 2 degrees here this morning. Okay, tonight's talk, we've got Dan talking about a look at Azure integration service landing zones, the bane of my existence at the moment, but we'll hear from Dan to sort out some of my issues. So without any further ado, let me hand over to Dan and add Dan's slides to the stream. Welcome, Dan.
Okay, thank you, Bill. I assume you can see my slide.
They haven't come up just yet, so just give them a little bit of a second to come up. There they are.
There they are. Okay, fantastic. All right. Well, thanks, Bill. Thanks for the opportunity to present tonight. Looking forward to it. If you don't know who I am, I'm I work for Deloitte as a consultant in their consulting business. My official title is Senior Engineering Lead, but nobody knows what that means. So I usually just call myself a Senior Integration Specialist. There's a bunch of other really boring information on this slide about me, which you can always find by looking me up on LinkedIn. But I'll talk to something more interesting instead, which is that photo. That's me standing on top of Mount Sinai in Egypt. So a few months ago, I had the great privilege of going on a Holy Land pilgrimage that included Jordan, Israel, and Egypt. And one of the many highlights of that trip was being able to climb Mount Sinai. Now, I've climbed a few mountains in my time, but this was quite a different experience because the goal was to get to the top of the mountain right at sunrise, which meant that you had to climb it in the dark. We started about 2 a.m. So it took about 4 hours to get there. So it was interesting. It was a bit grueling, but I was very happy to get up there. I didn't get to unfortunately see my old friend Moses up there, but he did leave behind some really good tips for me, and about 10 of them actually, in fact. Anyway, getting on with the presentation. We all know that integration is hard, right? And that's probably why we like it. We like the challenge of it. Probably one of the reasons you're watching this webcast is because you want to learn something from it. So in the context of the landing zone, it's good to understand what some of those challenges are and how the landing zone is actually going to help us in that. So if we start just with the concept of integration itself, just getting across that means, you have to know an awful lot about these main features or capabilities. For example, messaging, which is really at the heart of integration. It's how you exchange data between all of the players in the solution. And then transformation is being able to make those messages palatable by each of the players, because not everybody speaks the same language when it comes to data structure or even protocols. Orchestration is about being able to code those long-running business processes where you need, and it also gives you the ability to implement all of those patterns that we know and love in integration, things like scatter and gather and sequential convoy and all of those things that you read about in the Hope and Wolf book, Enterprise Integration Patterns. And of course, integration is not going to work at all if you can't connect to the systems or applications that you're trying to integrate with. So connectivity usually involves, having adapters and being able to navigate across different protocols and across networks, especially when you have hybrid scenarios. And event handling is actually quite important in integration these days when we kind of expect everything to work in real time. So you want your applications to be reactive so that they can respond immediately to events as they happen. And we all know that APIs kind of make the digital world go around. They're usually a big part of any integration solution. So to manage all those APIs, you need some sort of a gateway that can host them and handle things like your security and your authentication and exposure and all the other features like caching and stuff that you need to do. So that's quite a handful there just to get across. And that's the minimum requirement for you to be an integration specialist or an architect, is you have to understand all of those things. But it doesn't end there. because in any solution, you also have to deal with all the non-functional requirements. For example, scalability. Just because you deploy your solution in the cloud doesn't automatically make it scalable. I mean, in theory, the cloud is infinitely scalable, but only if you build your solution in a way to take advantage of that. And then performance is often an issue, especially if you have applications that are critical where low latency is essential. I remember a few years back, we were building this integration for all the systems in a brand new hospital. And, the latency there had to be within just a few milliseconds, or people's lives depended on that. And if it's a critical system, then you need to have that sort of resilience built in. So it's got to be available, it's got to be reliable, and you have to have disaster recovery in place. A typical example of that is if you're building something for emergency services. I don't need to talk much about security. We all know how important that is, especially in days like today where there's so much cybercrime. And when that system goes live, it's going to have to be able to be looked after. So it needs to be maintainable and interoperable. And your organization also may have compliance concerns as well, particularly if you're working in government or you have sometimes just compliance to standards in very mature organizations. So in order to affect all of that, you really need to be across a whole lot of peripheral capabilities and technologies and stuff in order to make that solution work. And as an integration expert, we're not necessarily well versed in all of those things, but they are critical to the application. And then, of course, whatever cloud that you choose to implement in, and you've got to be across how to do all of that in that specific cloud. Now, one of the things that I think Microsoft's competitors in the integration space do is they often market their products a little bit better. Because if you're going to buy something like MuleSoft or Toomey or what's the other one, TIBCO, there's a few of them out there, but they often, integration comes in a package, it's in a box, and everything is all there together for you. And when a customer's buying it, they know that they're getting what they're getting and that they're getting everything they need for integration, or at least that's the sales message anyway. But in Microsoft when you say how are you going to do your integration to Microsoft, and you say, well, simple, Azure, then the customer goes and looks up Azure and they see something like this. So we know that this is actually a great story, right? Because one of the things that makes the Microsoft Cloud so competitive is the sheer breadth and scope of all the services that they offer. But at the same time, if you're looking for an integration solution, it's not very obvious where you even start in all of this, and if you can tell them, well, you use this service and you use this service and that one. But even for the people, our professionals who are building these solutions, unless they're really well versed in all of those services, it's a bit daunting trying to figure out how to make it all work. So a few years ago, Microsoft helped to address that problem by creating Azure Integration Services. And really all this was a marketing label that was applied to a handful of services that we know we always use in integration solutions. And there was a nice little white paper that came with it as well that actually discussed each of those services and the role that it would play in integration. And, that was all certainly very helpful. Wasn't entirely without issues because, for one thing, over the last few years, I think I've seen about 5 or 6 different versions of this diagram. And also, not all of the services are there. There's actually quite a few more that we would probably regularly use that aren't represented. But more importantly, while the white paper told you how to use these specific services to build integration, it didn't cover all of those non-functional requirements, peripheral concerns that we just talked about a few slides ago. So hopefully you're familiar with the Cloud Adoption Framework. It's been around for a while with Microsoft, and what it essentially is a full life cycle framework that gives you best practices, heaps of documentation, and even some tooling to help you implement a business and technology strategy in your cloud. It's basically jump-starting an organization to get ready for the cloud in Microsoft and be able to handle everything in there. And one of the features that comes in that framework is the Azure landing zone. So there's the official Microsoft definition of what a landing zone is, but effectively, it's kind of a way to quickly provision an environment and do it in an automated fashion through infrastructure as code. And it would be following all of Microsoft's best practices. That means that it's built to be scalable, and it's also important that it's modular, because you'll see in a moment that it's actually quite large, and not every organization needs every aspect of it. So you need to be able to kind of choose what you want from that framework. Now, there's basically two types of landing zones. The first one is a platform landing zone, which is probably the most common one we see used. And that's basically installing all of the kind of infrastructure that you need to build your solutions in the cloud. So you basically, your networking, your security, your identity, authentication, your management, monitoring services, all of that kind of stuff. And laying out your subscriptions and your, what's the word I'm looking, management hierarchies and all that kind of stuff as well. The application landing zone is usually more targeted at kind of a functional sort of application or platform. So with the CAF, this is an example of the platform landing zone. And you can see it's quite large. It's designed for a full enterprise implementation in the cloud with multiple subscriptions and even different kinds of sub landing zones in there to manage certain things. Again, why I said it had to be modular is because not every organization necessarily needs all of that, but it's a good starting point for ones that do. And it would always follow the best practices. Some of the application landing zones that are included under CAF are these ones, and you can see that they get very specific at things like being able to implement a Kubernetes cluster, for example, or a landing zone for HPC solutions, those kind of things. But what's not in there is how they set up an integration environment. They didn't have that one included. So that's why it was so important that recently Microsoft released the Azure Integration Services landing zone. And that basically gives you everything that you need to build an effective integration solution in the cloud. So there's basically two parts to this landing zone. The first is the reference implementation, which is by using the tooling, which is essentially ARM templates and scripts. It gives you the ability to deploy to the cloud a fully working and ready integration environment that you can do it in minutes. Well, actually it takes a little over an hour, but with APIM, but anyway, you can get quickly deployed. But the other part of it that I think is extremely useful is all of the documentation that comes and a whole heap of reference articles that each comprised of design considerations, as in the things that you need to think about before you start deploying or designing a solution, and then the design recommendations is how to do things in a way that follows best practices. It's very, very heavily based on the CAF, on the Cloud Adoption Framework, and also the well-architected framework, which is another framework that Microsoft Azure offers us. So if we look at the actual design areas that are discussed here, the first thing you should notice is that they kind of correspond to all of those peripheral and non-functional areas that we talked about earlier. This isn't going to teach you how to build enterprise integration patterns, right? We've got plenty of documentation that tells us how to do this. It isn't going to tell you how Service Bus works or how Logic Apps works. Now, there's heaps of documentation for that, and most of us integration experts know that already. But it actually tells you all that other stuff that we're probably not experts in. I'm an integration architect, but I would never consider myself an expert in network topology. So it's really, really helpful to have this documentation that tells us how to manage best practices in Azure for integration services in all of these areas that we're likely not experts in. So I should give credit where it's due. This project came into being it was run by Microsoft. Kent Ware is the project team leader on that, and he's joined by Kunal and Jordan, and also Elkan, who's an MVP. But they also contracted out to Afinis to actually do the reference architecture implementation on that. And some of you may recognize Daniel Probert's name. He's one of the big authors of the BizTalk Migrator tool, which you may or may not have used or heard of. So what I want to do now is basically go through each of these 6 design areas. And I'm not going to discuss things in huge detail because it's all there in the documentation, and I'll show that to you, and I'll show you how to access it. But just to give you a helicopter view, so you actually know what kind of stuff is in there and how valuable it would be. So we'll start with identity and access management, and just to be clear, we're not talking about access to your app at the application level, like authentication, that kind of stuff. This is more about for deployment and maintenance of the Azure resources itself. So as I mentioned before, each of these design areas has a design considerations and then a design recommendations part. And in the design considerations, they cover things like determining, these are things you should think about before you start, basically, is think about what are the actual administration activities that you're going to need and what boundaries need to be around them. And then think about how you're going to do these. I mean, it's always easiest to give everybody God mode, but that's probably not best practice, right? So if you think about who's going to be responsible for maintaining what, then you can actually think about how you might assign roles to those individuals or those positions. And not only in terms of areas like network areas or things of the solution, but also consider what your resources are, who are the experts in those particular resources, and how you might distribute the work and the access to those people so that they can access only the resources that they're actually trained to access. And then when it comes to recommendations, so first of all, you're going to see that very as it commonly mentioned in this principle of least privilege. We all know that that's a good best practice, right? We also very rarely do it properly, but that's certainly something that you want to aim for in this. With Azure, you get fantastic role-based access control, and it is incredibly granular. You can go all the way as high as the subscription level or management group level, all the way right down to not just individual resources, but sometimes features and operations and functionality in that particular resource. There are literally thousands of built-in roles in Azure. But if you can't find what you need in there, you also have the ability to create custom roles, and that can help. So there's really no excuse for not having fine-grained access control in your solutions. You're also going to see Azure Policy mentioned a lot. If you're not familiar with it, I would really highly recommend you check it out, because Azure Policy is a very, very powerful feature for restricting what people can do, both in deployments and in operation and at runtime, and also for being able to report when things sort of fall out of compliance. So moving on to the next design area, I think network topology and connectivity is the largest part of the documentation that they've supplied. It's really quite extensive. So in terms of considerations, one of the first things you want to think about is whether you're building a traditional hub and spoke model, which usually means that you have a hub that contains your main network resources like your firewall and your gateways and stuff, and everything has to go through that. Sometimes in a large organization, you may have multiple hubs. But then when it comes to doing VNet peering, it can be a little bit complicated to do transitive connectivity. And by transitive, I mean network A can connect to network B, and network B can connect to network C, but that doesn't mean that A can connect to C necessarily. To do that, you gotta kind of mess around with a few things like UDRs and NVAs in order to make that work. And if you don't want that complexity, Microsoft does give you what they call a virtual WAN, which I guess the best way I could describe that is almost like a PaaS way of implementing network, where Microsoft manages a lot of that stuff for you. Of course, the downside of that is the more Microsoft manages, then the less control, fine-grained control you have over things. So that's a decision you kind of have to make. You also might want to think about your IP addressing. This is especially important when you've got hybrid solutions. You've got to make sure that the network addresses you choose don't collide with things in your on-premise network because as you connect those, you're obviously going to have some collisions there. So you need to worry about that. You need to think about whether you want custom or Azure private DNS. So in the integration space, most of the Azure integration services support custom DNS names, but not all of them. The ones that do, APIM, logic apps, functions, storage, they all support custom domains. But Data Factory, Service Bus, Event Grid, and Event Hubs, they do not. So you need to think of a different solution for that, which might be Azure Private DNS. Also think about your encryption and certificate authentication. Where are you going to perform the termination of your TLS? Is it going to be at the front door of your organization, or do you need to carry it through all the way to your backend systems? When you're talking about hybrid solutions, there's multiple ways to do that. Each has sort of their advantages and disadvantages. So think about how you might accomplish that, because that has an impact on your architecture. And also, when you're dealing with PaaS services, they don't get deployed into a virtual network. But the way you can connect them to virtual networks, you've got a couple of options there. You can use service endpoints, or you can use private endpoints, private links. So again, there's advantages and disadvantages to each kind. So think about that in advance. And then as far as recommendations go, so this is where the most extensive part of the documentation is. What it does, and I'll show you this later, it actually takes each one of these services and talks about how you implement it in a network. And it's very extensive documentation with lots of diagrams and stuff. It is incredibly useful. Here's an example of one of the diagrams that they give, which actually kind of matches a bit with the reference implementation that they do. You can see that they're connecting all these services using private endpoints. It's probably a little easier to see it that way. Okay, the next design area is security. Obviously, very, very important. And you can already guess some of the things, I think, which going to be covered in here. But again, for design considerations, obviously consider first what are you talking about, a private cloud or a public cloud, or whether it's a mixture of both. Obviously, if it's going to be public, you're going to have to be very concerned about how you expose those services in a safe way. And whether or not you need some DNS obfuscation. So for publicly exposed resources. So again, like I mentioned before, there were a number of Azure integration services support custom domain names, but not all of them. So some of the other ones, you might have to look at the way you name them so that you can basically obfuscate them a little bit and not make it so obvious what the implementation is behind it. As far as recommendations go, I won't go into all of these in detail, but you probably recognize a lot of them. If you're not using managed identities, I'd have to ask why, because it just makes things so much easier. Obviously, encryption, gateways or WAFs are definitely needed when you're exposing out to the internet. Interestingly enough, I should say, the gateway or WAF is not implemented as part of the reference architecture yet. But that's something that you would think about adding. Azure policy, again, mentioned. You'll see it mentioned quite a few times in here. It can very effectively support enforce some security measures and restraints there. Microsoft Defender for Cloud is an excellent product in Azure to help you manage all of that. And I hope everybody's storing their secrets in Key Vault and not putting them in your source code. There's a lot more topics here. So IP filtering, a lot of the services, the PaaS services support that kind of IP filtering, so you can lock it down. For example, you can ensure your logic app only gets called from an APIM and not elsewhere, if that's what you want to do to keep everything kind of locked down. Least privilege approach, we've mentioned that before already. And they also recommend for automating as much as you possibly can in your deployments, because automation means that you have not only consistency, but it becomes easier to kind of enforce your standards and compliance that way. Okay, moving on to management. So again, this kind of ties in what we covered in the first design topic too, with the identity and access, is thinking about what are the resources you're going to be deploying, and then what are the ones that you need to monitor. And how are you going to track messages when you're going from end to end? A lot of systems and applications may do a good job of logging and tracing within their application, but when you're going across integration spaces, you need to be able to understand where are those messages and outputs winding up, and how do you manage that? You think about whether you're involving any external systems and what it's going to be like trying to monitor that. What kind of access do you need to those external systems? And obviously thinking about your alerting and tracking levels, how deep does it need to go? Do you need to do you want to store message bodies, for example, for your auditing? Do you need a dashboard? Is your systems complicated enough that you would help to actually have that on single page view of everything and how it's working? And also thinking about what queries are going to be executed. And it's good to think about this before you build. Back in the old BizTalk days, we had business activity monitoring, or BAM, which was such a powerful feature in BizTalk, but it was rarely ever used the way it was intended to. Because BAM wasn't meant to just do basic instrumentation. It was meant to actually track business processes and give insights into what's actually happening in your business processes. But in order to make it work, you actually had to think about that when you were developing and figure out where to put all the touch points in it. So same thing that you should be asking in your solutions here. Often these things are an afterthought, and they really shouldn't be. And what kind of management tasks, for example, are you going to need to resubmit messages that fail, or restart a logic app or something like that? So, and then how are you going to manage who can do that and how it's done? So recommendations here. Application Insights, of course, is a built-in capability in Azure, which is very, very powerful for being able to monitor solutions and diagnose issues, and also just get a feel for how things are performing. It's backed by log analytics, which is the logging source in it. And if you're not using it, you really should learn more about it, because it's incredibly powerful. And then if you're using logic apps, there's some features you may not know about, which is the client tracking ID that you can set to a business value. So it can, this would be meant to be what we used to call it an interaction ID in BizTalk, I think, but it's basically a unique identifier that allows you to correlate everything across an entire end-to-end process. But you can choose what that is, and it makes sense to be, for example, an order number or something like that. That makes sense to the business. You can set that feature. You can also create your own custom track properties as well for logic apps. Again, all of this stuff that kind of helps you diagnose issues and see what's actually happening in your applications.
Hey, Dan, we've got a quick question from Matt Dawson. Do the reference articles have any coverage for running integration services in an Azure Arc hybrid environment using the runtimes?
Azure Arc, I don't think is actually mentioned specifically in that integration. There is obviously in the networking area, it talks about how you build hybrid applications, but not specifically with Azure Arc. No, I didn't see anything in there for that. But that's a good point to kind of ask them. And later on, I'm going to talk to you about how you can contribute to this and stuff. So let's keep that one in mind.
Okay.
There are, of course, if App Insights doesn't give you everything you need, then there are third-party tools you can use. For example, Kavai's Serverless 360, which is a very powerful tool. And what's also kind of nifty is the documentation gives you some sample Custo queries. So Custo is the language that we use to query log analytics. And if you're not used to it, it can be a little bit quirky to get across. So having those example queries really helps you a little bit to get started. It's actually a very, very powerful language and very performant in terms of being able to pull data out of the log analytics. Okay, on to the governance section. So considerations, again, roles and responsibilities. We've seen that mentioned a few times right now. Who can do what? Thinking about how critical your system is, and if you need a disaster recovery plan. And if you do, then you got to think about what your RPO and your RTO is, and try to set them at something fairly reasonable. So that's that's definitely something you need to think about up front, because that has an impact on how you build your solutions. Sometimes even the tier levels that you choose for the products. Do you need an alert or an escalation plan? Generally, I would say yes. But then, what are the specifics of that? How critical is your system? When are you going to wake somebody up in the middle of the night, as opposed to send an email? Are there any compliance concerns that you have to think about? A perfect example in Europe would be GPDR, right? So, there are a lot of other government organizations compliance things as well that you might have to deal with, or again, maybe just standards compliance. And what kind of tooling are you going to use for remediation, and also for alerting you if there are any compliance violations? So in the design recommendations, obviously Azure policy. First way that you can probably effectively enforce your standards right from the point of deployment. And of course, speaking of deployments, again, we mentioned before that everything should be automated as much as possible with your CI/CD, and make sure that you have consistency there and everything. Using role-based access control wherever you can, and using it responsibly, not just giving everybody owner or contributor permission, but actually thinking about what roles people need to do to look after your applications. And Azure Monitor is a very, very powerful built-in feature for monitoring everything. Most of it happens automatically, so there's very little that you have to do. You don't have to make custom code or anything like that in your applications. It will pick up heaps of material on its own. But then again, there's also Serverless 360 from Kavai, and probably other third-party products as well. And Microsoft Defender for Cloud is really good from a security standpoint, again, for not only helping to enforce, but identifying risks and even telling you how to fix them. Then it comes to the last area, which is basically automation and DevOps. So I'm going to kind of fly through this a bit quickly. One of the things to consider up front is what you're going to use for your source control. There's multiple options there. So you have GitHub and Azure Service, for example. Each of them come with their own specific limitations. So you've got to kind of work out what's going to work best for your organization. Same thing with a branching strategy. There's many different kinds of branching strategies out there. Trunk-based development, GitHub Flow, GitLab Flow. Think about what's going to work best for your organization and then stick to it.
Hey, Dan, we've got another question from Matt Dawson. Governance considerations, including DR plans. Are there any recommendations about how to design to provide higher availability in DR?
I think there probably is in the documentation. We can have a look when I get into the demo of it, or there'll be at least some high level guidance there, I would hope.
Yep.
But mostly it's for the consideration, it's thinking about those things, because oftentimes I've been on projects where we're already going live or getting ready to go live, and then they stipulate, oh yes, and we need to have 30-minute RTO, and then you realize, well, that's not really going to be possible with how we built it. So version control, there's also lots of different ways to approach that, and many people will argue about how to do that. But the point is, make sure that you decide on a method to do it and be consistent, and also peer reviews. Again, we talked about automation and the benefits of using automation. And Azure policies can be deployed, by the way, as code. So they call it policy as code, can be deployed in your pipeline. So it's good to start with that right off the get-go. And depending on what services that you're using and where they're located, you might find that you have to use self-hosted agents instead of Microsoft agents. For example, if you need to reach down into on-prem, for example, to deploy resources, and self-hosted agents maybe have access, network level access, that you wouldn't get otherwise from the Microsoft hosted. Recommendations. These are pretty standard. Deploy early and often, obviously. That's what CI/CD gives you the ability to do. It's a good idea to separate your infrastructure pipelines from your application pipelines, because you can guess which ones are deployed more often, right? So we tend to do that in our organization. We do the infrastructure in its own set of pipelines. And then even in the application ones, we have separate pipelines for the for the application components and the configuration, because oftentimes the configuration is the thing that changes more often. And that way you can run that pipeline and only change configuration without touching anything else. Obviously, store your secrets properly. You've got Key Vault there to use. Test your business logic and your unit test and your non-functional requirements with your load tests. Obviously, make sure that you peer review all your code. No PR should be approved without another developer looking at it to make sure that, that's the 4 eyes principle. And automate as much as possible for consistency and repeatability. So that was a handful going through all the documentation. Now we'll talk a little bit about the actual reference architecture. So this diagram shows you there are actually 2 scenarios. One is the platform kind of landing zone, which is this one, and then there's one that's more of an application kind of one. We'll mention that briefly later, but this is the main one for the platform. And when you run it, and there's a nice little click to deploy in Azure button, this is what you're going to wind up with. Everything will get deployed to a single resource group. There will be a virtual network, and all of the services, the relevant services, are actually connected to that virtual network. So it's really good they've done that, because it's usually that connectivity to the network that's the most complicated part of working on how to deploy and how to hook this stuff up. And the fact that they've done it for you with that presumption that you want that means that they've solved a lot of that complexity for you using best practices. Everything is in a Git repo, and it's all nicely laid out. You can see all those folders that each of the components is kind of contained in its own template files. It's all using ARM templates. So it makes it a little bit easier to modularize, I think that's a word, your deployment. If you decide you don't want Data Factory, for example, it's pretty easy to eliminate that. And then there's one master template, which is that actually deploys everything for you. And that's the one that calls all the other ones. So with that, I think I'm just going to go and actually show it to you live. So give me a second here. Hopefully you should see my browser now. Do you, Bill?
Sorry, I was looking for the unmute button. Yes, yes, I can see it just fine.
See it. Okay, fantastic. So this is the homepage for the Integration Services Landing Zone Accelerator. There's obviously a nice little README file here that kind of talks about everything that I pretty much talked about. You get links to all of the different documentation areas. You can jump straight there. For example, if we go to network and topology, this is where I said they had that extensive amount of documentation in here. So there's your reference network topology, which is what gets deployed when you deploy the reference architecture. But then it goes through, talks about all the considerations, and then it starts to go through each service. So yes, for example, network design for storage accounts, network designs for app service environments. And there's a whole section on each one of those, often with a lot of diagrams to kind of help you through all of that. So very, very useful documentation. So all that would live under the docs folder. The source folder actually has all the templates in there, but there's also a link directly there to these 2 scenarios. Scenario 1 is your platform implementation. The scenario 2 is more of kind of more of an application type of landing zone. But let's look at this main one here. So this is the reference implementation. Again, that you see where I got that image from before. It tells you everything that gets deployed. And you have a nice little deploy to Azure button in here. So obviously, if you're doing this in a real organization, and particularly if you're going in production, you're not going to use this particular thing. But if you want to just get started with it and see what it looks like and how it hangs together, that is a very, very convenient way to do it. So I'll just show you what that looks like, because there are some nifty features in it. Helps if you're signed in. So what that button does is it takes you to a custom deployment template in Azure. Just give that a second to load. Okay. So what it effectively does is it loads up the ARM template that's in that Git repo, and it's kind of nice to have this view of it because you get that little tree view on the side that takes you to everything. So you can see all the different things that are deployed and jump to it specifically. And I suppose it allows you to edit it here, but there's a bit of a problem with that. I wouldn't recommend doing that. The moment you edit anything in this file, no matter how, even if it's perfectly valid ARM template lingo, it will break the deployment. And the reason for that is because it loses the reference to all the modules that are in the Git repo. Because the moment you change it and edit it here, it starts using a local instance that's cached somewhere. So it will break your deployment. If you wanted to edit anything in here, I would basically clone the Git repo and make your edits there, and then run the deployment from there. But it's kind of neat because it gives you all the parameters that you need in this nice little form. So like everything you deploy in Azure, you've got to choose your subscription and your resource group that you're going to deploy to. You choose where it's going to be deployed. So this system prefix, all that is a token that's going to be at the start of every single resource that gets deployed. So it just basically is a naming convention thing. And I would advise you to take the hint from what they put here, keep it very short, like probably 3 or 4 characters at most, because some of the resources that get deployed have length limits on the names. And if you type something long in here, your deployment will fail.
Yes, but there's one thing to consider is that names are unique for some of the resources. So if you leave it AIS and you deploy it into the Southeast Australian region, you're going to get your API management fails to configure because the name's not unique.
That's right. That's right. So when I did my deployment, I think I put IDU on it or something like that. Yes, keep it. Now this is important to note. The environment here, they give you a choice of dev, viewet, and prod. All that is an array of values which you can customize if you have other environments. But the important thing to realize is that this changes absolutely nothing of what gets deployed. All it does is put another token in the names. That's all. It's not going to change the tier levels of anything that's deployed. And then these are all the address spaces, which unless you really know what you're doing with the network, I probably wouldn't mess with these. I just leave them the way they are because they've been set based on the typical best practice. And then just you can have an admin email and an organization if you want. One of the nifty things about the custom deployment is that you can click this visualize button. And what it does is it actually draws the different deployment packages with their dependencies all graphed for you. And that's kind of handy to know if you decide maybe you don't want to deploy something. For example, if I decided for whatever reason I don't want App Insights, well, I'm gonna see that I'm gonna have to remove the dependencies from at least 3 different things that are currently pointed to that. Whereas if I want to get rid of Data Factory, for example, that would be easy because nothing is dependent on Data Factory. So you can zoom in and out on this diagram, and you can move things around if you want to print it or save it as an image. When you do export it, by the way, as an image, just be aware that it exports exactly what's showing on the screen. So if I zoom in like that and export it, that's what I'm going to get, is this. So always do the zoom to fit first before you do the export. Okay. So basically to deploy this, all I have to do is do next or review and create. I'm not going to do that now because I've already done it, and it takes about an hour to deploy everything, mostly because of APIM. That's the thing that takes the longest. But when you do deploy it, this is what you get. So you get a single resource group, which I called our RG-IDU demos, and all your resources get deployed into there. And you can see that the IDU is the prefix that I use, so it appears in every name. And I also chose the dev environment, so you see dev showing up in all of the names. But you can now get an idea of everything that's actually deployed and also the tier level. For example, things to be aware of, because we're deploying things in a virtual network, you pretty much have premium tier levels for all of those particular PaaS services, because that's what the level that you need to be able to make it connect to a virtual network. So there's a cost aspect of this, which I'll go into a little bit more detail in a moment. Excuse me. But also be aware that with all these resources that are deployed, there's nothing application specific in here. It's just the platform. So for example, there's no queues or topics deployed, right? That would be part of your application that you would do. And if you go into logic apps, for example, there'll be no actual workflows or schemas or maps or anything deployed. That's all part of your application. One thing they did do with APIM is they gave us a little bit of a break on that, is they deployed the developer edition by default with that. And that's because developer gives you all the same features as premium, except the SLAs, obviously. And clearly you should know that you would never use this developer edition in production, right? So that gives you a little bit of a break on the cost. But again, there's nothing, there's just the APIM itself is deployed. There's no APIs that are deployed other than the default Echo one that comes out of the box every time you deploy API. Great. I think that was pretty much what I wanted to show there. So I'll just head back to the slides, which would be here. There we go. All right. You should see the slide deck again now.
Yes.
Okay. So what I've drawn a little table here of what gets deployed with a little bar graph here to kind of show you where the bulk of the expense comes from. So obviously the service bus, premium service bus, is the most expensive thing that's deployed. The app service plans, they're also premium level plans because, again, they need to be able to connect to the network. And API management, you get a bit of a break on because it's developer edition. But then to get more specific about what happens, I actually did deploy this to a paid subscription just so I could monitor for it to see what it's costing per day. And what we found out is that it in Australian dollars, it costs about $52 a day to run this platform when you deploy it. And if you look at the breakdown of how it is, again, as you can imagine, service bus is the most expensive element, along with the logic apps, because they're in app service plans, right? That are premium level plans. It's logic app standard, by the way, that it deploys, just to clear that up. And remember that there's no applications or workloads, so this is just the cost for the platform itself, and that's using a developer SKU of APIM. So to give you an idea of the difference in cost, the developer edition, it's in US dollars, sorry. A developer edition will cost you about a little under $50 US a month. But when you go to the premium, it jumps up to the best part of $3,000 a month. So there's obviously going to be a cost for this to consider. Now, there was another scenario in that reference implementation too. And I mentioned this one was a little bit more of an application type of. This was basically solving a problem of integrating ServiceNow with Azure automation, so that basically when you create a ticket, it actually creates and provisions a team in Microsoft Teams. So the cool thing about this is that unlike the platform implementation, which uses ARM templates, this one uses Bicep. Now, the reason they didn't use Bicep on the platform, and I found this out when I talked to Daniel Probert at Integrate back in June, is because the custom template feature in Azure doesn't support Bicep yet. So with this scenario, you don't get your deploy to Azure button. You're going to have to deploy this one with some scripts, so it's going to take a little bit more to do it. And you're also going to need to provision 2 service principal accounts and implement OAuth 2.0 for authentication on it. But it does give you an example of a sort of an application type solution and how you might do that. Okay, so we're coming to the end here. So the next steps, There is a project board in the Git repo that you can access, and you can then see the kind of things that they have on their backlog. Mostly it's new scenarios and some new patterns that they want to implement. There's something I would like to see, which is scenario 1 being implemented in Bicep, but of course we'll lose our little handy deploy to Azure button. Not that you would ever use that anyway in a real organization, but so if you've got some suggestions, I'm sure there's a way to submit some requests in there. There's an issues log as well. So I remember somebody mentioned something before that they wanted to see about. Oh yeah, we didn't look at the disaster recovery stuff, did we? Maybe we'll do that at the end.
Yeah, so I put one in there to add Azure app configuration into that deployment.
Yep, that's something I was notably missing. Yes, in that one. Okay, and if you want to get involved, they would love you actually to kind of help work on this, because the team's kind of small and busy with a lot of other things. So you can all you basically have to do is get a CLA in place. That's a contributor license agreement. It's quite easy to do, and then you can start submitting pull requests if you want to change things. So I've had a couple of pull requests approved in there, and I know there's a couple of other people submitting. So maybe one from Bill coming up soon for AppConfig. And then I've got a slide here with some references as well for things if you want to look up further documentation. So that pretty much takes me to the end of my presentation. I'll leave that up there. That QR code will take you to my LinkedIn profile. And if you do ask to connect with me, I would just ask that you mention that you were at this presentation. So because I do get a lot of requests from people I don't know, and this way will just help me know, oh yes, okay, there's somebody who was at that presentation.
So I'll pop the first question from Matt up on there. Cat on the screen there, Dan, or not?
Oh, okay. Let me have a look at the StreamYard. Where is it? Okay. Do the reference oracles have any coverage of running integration and services? Okay. And I think we probably answered that one. I'm pretty sure they don't. I didn't see anything about deployment in containers. So.
Yep. So, and then the second one is about the DR.
Yep. Let's have a look at that. Because I'm curious now. So if we go back here, okay, first of all, I just need to go back to, yeah, that's fine. So that would be in the governance area. Okay, design considerations, I covered most of those. Was it governance or was it management? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so.
Yeah, okay. So they are, unfortunately, they're a bit light in this section of the documentation. They just mention the fact that you should have these in mind, but they don't actually give you examples of how to do it. The solution that gets deployed is in a single resource group in a single region. So it hasn't done a DR type of deployment for you. That's something you would have to orchestrate that yourself.
And the interesting front one from even the API management deployment, their landing zone puts API management inside of the VNet and then puts app gateway in front of it. Mm-hmm. And so you would have to then put front door in front of app gateway. And you'd have to have two unique instances of API management.
Oh, okay. If you were going to do DR.
Yeah, because the way it's setting inside of VNets, I don't think you can, the premium, even though you're using premium APIM, because it's inside of VNets, I don't think they can talk to each other.
Right.
So there is some work to do on some of the stuff that they've done. But I do think that the availability zones will work with a lot of this stuff, and make it a bit more highly available than it is to start with. So, um, but it would be good if they added some of that stuff to um, some of the landing zone deployments. But they do, the complexity gets a lot more complex very, very quick when you start doing multiple regions.
Yes.
And things like that. So, because that's one thing that it didn't seem to put into the naming convention
That's
is the
true.
region.
Mm-hmm.
So, because some of if you look at the latest naming convention documentation in Azure, it does take into account. It's got the region in it. It's got the region in it. So yeah, so that would
Yeah.
help.
Yes.
So you'll be
Long
able
version
to,
of it too. It takes
yeah.
up a lot of characters.
And my deployment the other night, I tried to use AIS BC and then prod, and it made the storage account name too big, and I think key vault too big, and it
That's right.
failed. So, but yeah, some of that availability zone stuff might help because most of those products support availability zones with minimal impact. So,
Yep. So it is just kind of a reference for you. It kind of gets started. I guess if you're an organization had no integration capability in Azure and all, and they wanted to get something up there and running fast, this would get you started. And then of course you would build out things as you needed appropriately. But yeah, it would be good to have that example of a multi-region deployment because that's where a lot of complexity comes
yeah,
in
and
very,
then
very
it
quick.
depends on how far your DR needs to go too, because can you use availability zones? Do you trust the location? So Sydney's where the availability zones are at. Or do you need to deploy to both Sydney and Melbourne?
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the outages over the last couple of years, when Azure went out, Azure went out. When AWS went out, AWS went out. So do you need to deploy to both?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So the DR can become a fairly sticky proposition fairly quickly.
That's right.
So
I guess that's one of the advantages of the container-based deployments now is that you can put them in multiple clouds, multiple cloud
yeah,
providers. Yeah.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So and I've been playing a little bit around lately with the um, Logic Apps workspace that gives you the functions and the Logic app in the same project.
Hmm.
And a lot of people are using functions to do work for like code base. Like one of my clients is using it for encryption decryption for PGP. So they've got the Logic app calls off to a function to do that. You can now put that code in the same project as your Logic apps in the function section, and you don't have to deploy a separate function.
Oh, that's nice.
And it calls locally inside of that space, so you don't have another attack surface. You don't have HTTP traffic traveling across the wire for it.
Mm-hmm. Oh, because it would all stay on the Azure backbone.
Well, no, it actually is local into the Logic
Oh,
app
yeah,
because
it's
it
on
calls
my
it
machine.
a DLL.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah,
okay,
that's
Matt replied to that DR talk. Let me just put that up there. Agree with the feedback on DR and availability. Is also interested in service bus as a primary and secondary regions. So, yeah, so last time I heard, I think they were working on some stuff to make service bus a little bit better at failover. Didn't
mm-hmm.
they mentioned that at Integrate? I think they're
Yes.
working on some better stuff for service bus in terms of that, because it was like if you had things in the queue when it failed over, those things didn't fail over, and you
Mm-hmm.
got the new stuff in the new one. But I think they were talking at Integrate about the ability to be able to do to be able to replicate that data for you.
Obviously, you would expect that would have an impact on latency, wouldn't it? A little bit, because it would have to copy.
Yeah, it'll have an impact on the latency, but they were working on some stuff around that too. Availability zones will be a lot easier because it's local and it's higher speed, where primary, secondary regions will be a little bit slower.
They seem to solve that latency thing with Cosmos, didn't they? Because isn't that one of
but it just depends on what the latency is between the region. So they're getting pretty good on the latency from that. We've been thinking about doing some testing in the 2 camera regions because they're in the same city. You should almost be able to do SQL HA across the regions.
Right.
So, anything else?
Any other questions?
Nope, there's no other questions at the moment.
Okay. Yeah, I guess in your comment about it sounds like something we need to be patient about, or we can be proactive and get somebody to actually contribute. If they can put it,
Let me just flip this back to here, and I'll add my questions and the thank you. And yeah, thank you very much again, Dan, for presenting on that. As it happens, I've been playing with landing zones over the last couple of weeks, trying to sort some stuff out. And some people in Microsoft have an opinion that it has to be done one way. Some other people have a more progressive opinion that it depends. So just be a little bit careful with that, because I've got situations where the VNets are really not required because I'm not doing a lot of stuff on-prem. Most of the stuff I'm integrating with is cloud-based. So going in and out of the VNet for the cloud-based stuff doesn't make a whole lot of sense. You end up forcing a lot of traffic through an app gateway or things like that. But you still can do internally, like if you're using logic apps to functions and things like that, and storage and things like that, you can still put those in a VNet and use the endpoints, the private endpoints. And that cost is not as substantial as like the service bus cost and the API management cost when you try to put those into a VNet. And you can protect your logic apps the same way, because you can, if your API management instance is anything except consumption, it's got a static IP address. So you can tell your logic apps or your functions to only accept calls from that IP address. So, and it does help the deployment side of things, because you don't have to have your agent inside of your VNets. You've got accessibility from the outside. So, well, let's see. We got basically another comment from Matt. Thanks for walking us through this. Looking forward to diving into reference document and learning more about this from landing zones. Yep. So, and feel free, Matt, that when you've got your head around it and you maybe want to do a presentation about what you've discovered and things like that, you're more than welcome. Just reach out to myself or Dan, and we can set you up to do a integration down under talk.
Definitely.
So with that, I think it's about time. And so thank you again, Dan, for presenting. Thanks to everyone for attending. And I will have the talk up on our YouTube channel in the playlist so that you can have a look at. If you got other people that want to listen to this talk, you can. So I'm going to end the broadcast now. Thank you very much.
Have a good night.